Okay. So thanks everybody and to the people who just joined us. I mean, you came a bit late in the day, but you'll at least get to see one talk. But we're happy you made it nevertheless. So the final talk today is Ian and I are going to be presenting a framework for thinking about AI literacy. We're the co-authors of the textbook, An Inquirer's Guide to Ethics of AI. And our talk is entitled An Inquirer's Guide to Ethical AI Literacy. So I will start off, I suppose. Okay, so our approach, as we talk about it, in terms of when we talk about an inquirer's approach, the idea is that we're sort of trying to carefully understand and define what the problem is facing different people when it comes to all these different issues of using AI, understanding the limitations of AI, understanding when it might be appropriate and not appropriate to use AI. And again, we're trying to sort of avoid taking a particularly slanted approach in terms of being too pro or too negative, right? There's a lot of different needs and interests, and the appropriate thing is to try to balance those kinds of things because stuff's not necessarily going to go away. So we're going to begin by trying to indicate some conflicting values and try to define sort of what we think AI literacy. We're going to consider some means to some potential solutions to this. And finally, we're going to try to articulate the sort of beginnings of an AI literacy framework that will help not only potentially educators, but people outside of education as well. So the big thing to consider is when we're talking about AI literacy, right? AI is both a tool for accomplishing things, and it's also a source for information, right? So just to give you an example, not that long ago, I made a website for the Ethics of AI Society. I could have spent hours relearning how to do HTML, but I decided I did not want to do that. So I decided to use AI as a tool to help me save a bit of task. Maybe I was alienated from learning HTML again. I feel like if I had to learn it, I'd be more alienated. But the other important thing is that AI is also a source of information, right? And so the important thing is that we have to be literate both in terms of it as a tool, but also as a source of information. So, we feel the importance of clarifying these kinds of things because, again, you say AI literacy, a lot of people are like, I don't know what that means. And so one way we can kind of think about it, again, when we're thinking about the tool analogy, is to think about the concept of shop literacy, right? Do you understand how to use tools? Do you understand how to use building materials? Do you understand the limitations of these tools and the tolerances that they have? Do you know what the tool is really capable of it? Do you know why it's making that sound when you do that thing, right? A really good example of this is, again, if anyone's ever had to screw in screws and various things, you use the wrong screwdriver, you're trying to drill into the wrong piece of wood, you might split the wood or you might end up destroying your screw, right? Anyone who understands why screws are designed the way they are and the screw ends would probably be able to explain to you very easily why you're using the wrong screw, right? So we want to make sure we're a bit more understanding in terms of what are the limitations of these tools. The other thing, too, is understanding and developing media literacy skills. And it's interesting because, again, this is not a new problem, right? Building media literacy is something that's really difficult to do. It requires a lot of critical thinking. So if you're ever reading news or anything like that, you have to sort of think about, like, is this information really accurate? Who is making this information? How are they framing things? Are they framing things in certain ways to make you connect the dots in your head, right? What is the assumptions in the framing of the message? What are the potential biases in this message, right? Is there a motive for disinformation and what is not being said, right? What is the part of the story that you're not aware of? So when we're thinking about things like AI, again, we have to think about it as a source of information. It's feeding me information. What do we do with the information? Does it make any sense? Is it good? Is it bad? If it is bad, what do I do about it? How do I check if it's good? These are all important questions that apply not only again to media, but also to using something like AI as well.
Okay. This is kind of the framework that I was thinking that, we have what we might call stakeholders and constituents. And there could be more nuanced categories for this. But what we're thinking here is that these different stakeholders are going to have different values and concerns. Those don't always line up. And when they don't line up, you see this sort of rubber. Let me give you an example, right? Okay, so as an educator, which I often am playing this with, I want to think about a student who maybe is just using a chatbot or AI technology to write them. And you can imagine one of those students just says, write me an essay on Plato, right? And they are putting in any work and they just take what it spits out. You have another student who uses it to think about really thoughtful objections to the work that they've already done, right? I want to say there's a difference there and an important difference at that, right? It's that, the one student on the one hand isn't really putting in the work. They're not building up these skills. The other student is, putting in that work. And as instructors or educators, this is what I'm trying to do, right? Is if I'm going to use or implement AI technology, I want it to help them build up those study habits. Just to give you more of a picture of how this is going to take place, particularly with misalignment, right? One of the things that Matt and I are really concerned about is the stigma of disclosing and saying I'm using AI, and then educators saying, well, you didn't do any work, right? Or jumping to that sort of conclusion. And I think we really need to correct that sort of mistaken assumption, kind of misapprehension that some people would have, right? Because you can imagine, especially educators who are very reluctant or loath to use this technology, saying like, no, this is just the shortcut, right? And I think we don't need to do that. We can actually see how this is building up or developing these skills. So Matt and I are worried about the sort of stigma of disclosure, and maybe you have thoughts on that too that we can address in the Q&A period. Especially if you're using some of this AI technology, right? And thinking, well, are people actually, discounting the work that I'm doing? And if you're putting real work and thoughtful objections to it, then that's good.
And that we don't want to create policies that work against what we're trying to accomplish in the first place, right?
Yeah, gotta get this lined up.
So are you good?
Yeah, go for it.
So part of our issue, again, is trying to understand and define the sort of problems that are related to AI literacy. And of course, obviously, there's a wide network of different values and interests and concerns that people have. And so what we've effectively done is try to sort of group a lot of these concerns into three main categories. So we'll sort of go through each one by one. So when it comes to the idea of misunderstanding or misuse of the technology, right? So one of the biggest concerns that we have is the idea of AI idolatry, right? So this is the tendency, particularly by people who aren't familiar, to sort of see the AI as being all-knowing and all truthful, and you can just sort of rely on it for everything and sort of completely trust it and not really or just think it's smarter than you, right? And that therefore it doesn't make sense for you to challenge it because it's just so much more intellectually smarter than me. There are other issues relating to poor understanding of the limitations. So, for example, are there training data limitations? For example, if you're using it for philosophy, is it trained on continental philosophy and analytic philosophy? If you're talking about biology, is it trained on all the relevant disciplines that you're asking about? These are important questions to ask. What are the limitations? What are the potential bias concerns? There's also issues that are related to the fact that, again, most of these AI services are products. They're not designed to be educational tools. They're designed to be chatbots that people will use, right? And so there are issues about models becoming over complementary. Oh, what a great thing you wrote. Wow, isn't that wonderful, right? And so, again, if you're being fed this, particularly as a student, and you don't realize that it's doing this, that can be particularly harmful. The other thing, too, is that if you're using AI, depending on the settings, it can start to remember things about you, and then it will start sort of trying to anticipate what you want to do based on who it thinks you are. And sometimes that can be useful. It can say, oh, you study this. Oh, well, this is a relevant thing that maybe you should look at. And you might say, well, that's really helpful, right? But there are other times where maybe you're just doing a project and you don't want it throwing in all these other personal details from you and trying to let that influence the work as well, right? And then, of course, there's some issues that relate to stuff we've been talking about over, issues relating to understanding who is the author of content that comes out of or is informed or helped along by AI. And the fact that, people can just flat out use it to engage in fraudulent practices, right? So the second group of issues that we want to talk about is this issue of what we call epistemic health. So we've kind of defined it as the capacity for individuals and communities to reliably form, revise, and coordinate beliefs that are responsive to evidence, open to correction, and are action guiding in non-pathological ways. And so one of the things that we're really concerned about is that we don't want to inhibit certain skill development. We should be concerned about things like skill loss. Again, going back to the spelling issues, right? If you start to rely more and more on the technology, you might lose certain skills, right? Now that in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just a question of how these things can sort of pile on to each other and whether it creates issues where you start to become epistemically dependent upon AI to sort of do everything for you, right? Again, can you spell without using a spell checker? That's a really good example. There are some issues relating to the illusion of explanatory depth. So sometimes people will use this technology in ways where they sort of very quickly sort of seem to think that they have a much stronger understanding of a subject than they actually do. And so their user is somewhat diluted by what they're actually gaining epistemically from using these models. Again, there's some issues relating to information bias and manipulation. Again, if a model is particularly biased and you're not aware of that, then you're just sort of soaking up all those biases. So you need to think critically about the kind of information that you're receiving and also how it was put together in the first place, right? And then again, some issues relating back to authorship and responsibility. Do you understand whether you're capable of doing these things on your own? Are you, to what extent are you actually putting in the work? And are you again being deluded about the level of your own responsibility in terms of some of these issues? Yep.
This is kind of the new thing. It's Rosenblit is one of these psychologists who looked at this. And so what happens with chatbots, especially when you're using them, is they'll see very, very fluent things. They're articulate, right? They're going to chat with you. And this fluency leads to people thinking that they're gaining understanding from it. And so you can imagine, like, if I am researching nuclear reactors, and all of a sudden I think because I've had this really smooth exchange with the chatbot that I now know all about nuclear reactors, right? That's a pretty dangerous assumption, especially if I apply to, the nuclear power plant and think that I can run it after a few chats. This gives an illusion of explanatory depth. So it's really kind of, masking only a kind of superficial understanding that we have. So remember that fluency doesn't equal understanding, but these chatbots give this kind of real deceptive illusion to me.
So finally, the last sort of group of problems that we think are relevant when it comes to, again, are trying to articulate some conception of AI literacy are some of the mental health concerns that have arisen around AI usage. So again, just like the idea of intellectual dependency, do you start becoming emotionally dependent upon it? And it's important to remember that there is a difference there, right? Whether you seem to think that it's your friend or whether you feel like you can actually, you can't accomplish something without the AI is a bit different from whether you actually can do that without the AI, right? Do you have those epistemic skills? Yeah, so part of our approach is, again, trying to, again, focus on understanding the capabilities, understanding the fact that, again, different people might use it in different ways, and understanding, again, what does it mean if a student is using it to brainstorm versus using it to even revise for the sake of shortening word lengths, right? Those are very time-consuming activities that are really annoying sometimes, right? And so part of what we want to do is sort of be able to, with our framework, be able to build up new norms of judgment and also focus on the idea of experimentation as a sort of way of practically understanding the use of the tool.
Yeah.
So part of even on a technical level, it's important to understand how the technology works, right? Because again, there is this AI idolatry issue where sometimes students think that it's all knowing and things like this, when in reality, we're simply talking about statistically automated models that understand words in terms of as mathematical vectors within a sort of latent mathematical space, right? And so the way it's able to generate responses is by understanding statistically how different kinds of words go together, right? But that's very different from a kind of formal logical understanding of how things might actually bear out in terms of things like validity and truth and stuff like that, right? So instead you have the limitations of a tool that is very good at understanding the statistical relationships between concepts, right? So the interesting thing is that based on that kind of understanding, it makes more sense to use AI as a sort of brainstorming tool, for example, rather than as a tool to generate quotes for you or to pull specific things out of certain kinds of readings or to simply restate certain things, because again, it works statistically. And so it might have the tendency to kind of statistically vary, right? But that being said, there is still value in understanding statistically how certain concepts can relate together. I mean, that's how you can become aware of through AI things that you may not know, right? Just because it's capable of pulling in this big corpus of information and sort of saying, well, statistically, all this stuff fits with this stuff, right? But really, at the end of the day, it's up to you to then take the ball and say, okay, well, how does this stuff actually map onto the real world, right? And so again, going back to the issue of understanding the tool too, like there are not only several different tools out there that might be trained on slightly different data sets and might have therefore different kinds of skills and different abilities to weigh on in different subjects, but the tool itself has all these different options now that are built in, right? You can try to even create your own sort of custom versions of ChatGPT and things like that that may affect and skew what kind of results you get. So only to some extent by experimenting with some of these different settings and features might you actually learn, what actually is more effective for generating responses that are going to be useful for you versus just sort of typing something in and saying, well, is this a good thing or not, right? So again, part of the issue is understanding the tool on a sort of very practical level, right? I came across this not that long ago, and the interesting thing about it is that I actually find the assumption of it flawed, both because it assumes that we're all shiny, happy individuals before we go into ChatGPT. I feel like probably more people look like this going into ChatGPT than coming out of it. But the thing is, again, it's not simply going to be the case that everybody who uses it you're going to end up with this completely homogenized mess. Obviously, that's a potential concern. But people who have more experience and more understanding of the technology will be able to get more out of it, right? And so part of the understanding of how you use the tool is how creative and how how critically are you using the tool? How well do you understand what you're doing with it?
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, the cases of sort of academic misconduct too really are a concern for us, especially because oftentimes, the grounds are unclear, especially with a lot of AI technologies where we've talked about it in various presentations, right? Where you can't even sort of know how these AI systems are arriving at certain conclusions because of the opacity, because of the black box problem, right? And if you're going to accuse a student of doing that, I mean, then how do you address this when you get it home, right? In particular, that becomes a huge concern. Imagine being accused by a professor that you did not generate this work when indeed you did. And it could be because you just have some idiosyncratic way of writing things right like the chatbots themselves or AI systems. So there's this range of concerns too, especially at these different levels that we've talked about with the students, educators, facilitators, and admin, right? Especially, I think that this is one of the bigger ones that's coming up with access and equity
So again, part of what we want to do is try to build up better norms for building better epistemic and mental health. So again, focusing on things like fact verification practices. Again, the understanding that you can go back to the primary source reading and confirm and double check whether anything AI tells you makes sense or does not make sense, right? Again, oftentimes early, students who are undergrads may not necessarily think to do that, right? But it's an important step. They're also important, again, focusing on issues of social validation and not just sort of being by yourself, talking to other people. So we can try to avoid some of the issues relating to delusion. We can think about strategies for countering AI bias by being more considerate about where, how the AI was trained and what kinds of limitations might exist within it. Focusing on experimentation to develop good and better AI practices, demonstrating the skills in the real world, again, orally defending what you're saying, those kind of things. And again, just sort of focusing on critical thinking overall. So this is essentially the beginnings of our framework, right? So the idea is that we're going to be focusing on a couple of different areas of concern and trying to generate sort of useful questions that we can either ask ourselves to build better understandings, or that a student or a user could ask themselves in order to help inform and think more critically about what they're actually doing, right? So this includes things like accuracy, trying to understand, how generally accurate is the model, how prone is it to hallucination, is the model more overly confident, am I treating it as overly authoritative, are there certain sort of fuzzy boundary cases that you should be aware of, particularly in just understanding the domain of something, right? I mean, very rarely are we, particularly in sciences, dealing with things that are just sort of absolutes, right? So if a model gives you an answer and it's essentially giving you a statistical answer, but you take it as being a sort of definitive absolute result, obviously that's a problem, right? There are also some issues relating to interpreting interpreting outputs. So what kind of background assumptions were the developers who made the model working with? Where did the training data come from? Are there any major biases I should be aware of? Does the LLM have my best interests in mind? Is it a product? Is it an educational tool? Is it developed to be a therapist, or is it just a general chatbot, right? Did you want to?
No, I'm tired. You can take it away.
Okay.
So
the other areas are issues relating to things like functionality. So what's the overall purpose of the model? Again, is it a product or a tool? Is the AI like to be overly complementary? What are good practices for developing what kinds of prompts that might be effective at getting the kind of feedback that we might want? What are the different settings and features of the LLM that might be able to help me along the way? And then there's other thing too is, again, focusing, I think one of the things that we were kind of excited about is the idea of building a framework that would allow for a certain degree of modularity, where you can kind of sort of say, well, how discipline specific is it, and how relevant is it to different kinds of disciplines or even things outside of education, right? Where you might start saying, to what extent is the model really familiar with the thing I'm actually really asking? I mean, again, these are sort of they're literally called large language models. They're modeling language. They're not necessarily modeling how you understand or how a discipline understands itself, right? So again, you might be thinking, are there disciplinary norms or standards that the model may not be aware of in terms of what we would consider to be a sufficiently good answer? Are there any biases or controversies within the literature, right? So again, within disciplines, not everybody always agrees. And does the model know this, right? Is it aware? And to what extent is it aware of the disagreements? Is it just going to give you an answer and say, this is it, take it, right? And then also some issues of like, how interdisciplinary is it? Does it understand the relationship between different kinds of disciplines? If not, then again, that can result in problems for the same reason that you can have without AI, where if you don't have people who have a sort of interdisciplinary understanding of certain kinds of issues, you'll get sort of compartmentalized answers that may not necessarily cohere or fit together terribly well. And then the final groups that are part of our framework, so these include issues relating to authorship. In what way am I retaining authorship of the research? What kinds of collaboration checks and balances can I put into place? Am I cognitively depending or deferring on the AI model? Is there a risk of AI psychosis in these kinds of cases? And again, some of these questions overlap, but again, what are the expectations of my discipline, right? That might matter a lot, particularly in terms of determining authorship. And then finally, our last category are issues relating to privacy and trust. So what information am I putting into the LLM? What happens to the information that I give it? And is this product tempting me to make further use of it? Because again, just like social media, right? It has its own agenda, right? It's not necessarily designed for your epistemic health or mental health in mind, right? Did you want to close this?
I think so. I mean, I'll just be reiterating many of the points that we made, but we're primarily thinking about how does it support inquirers, how does it support us to formulate better questions, right? Have those frequent concerns that I think we need as human beings. And so, just to reiterate this point, it's about the sort of critical assistance rather than the replacement. One idea I'll tell you that Matt is writing the book. And the title of it is called The Algorithm Made Me Do It, right? We're just sort of following the algorithm. And, you can imagine how people are going to start to say things like that, right? And they're no longer answerable or responsible for these things. But I don't think we should let that happen, right? And I think people need to take responsibility, especially those who are employing it. And so the educational outsourcing is a real concern, right? We want students to improve, we want educators to understand this technology, and especially the administrators and policymakers. And so that's our Inquirer's approach to ethical AI literacy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Patrick? I figured class we did a lot of work with argument outlining. Curious what you think about using argument outlines for that the student actually wrote them.
Yeah. So and this is something that I've tried to do a little bit and since then, right? So what Patrick's talking about is the idea of scaffolded assignments, right? So rather than again focusing on the product, the paper, right? The focus is on the process of writing a paper, right? And so one of the things I'll get students to do is come up with an argument outline, and then they might have to discuss their outlines with each other before eventually they might proceed to the writing stage. And so what I've tried to do as well is experiment with the idea of getting students to use AI in that one sort of way, just at the early sort of brainstorming stage, right? Because part of the advantage, I mean, I genuinely think that AI is probably most effective in academic context when you're using it as a kind of sophisticated search engine. The other thing too is while AI is limited, and yes, it can lead to delusion and stuff like this, it can also be a check on our own idiosyncratic nature, right? I mean, how many students think, "Oh, I've come up with the best, the greatest argument," right? You wouldn't believe, right? And of course, it deserves an A. But having something come along very early in the writing process, and ideally it might be a prof, but I mean, but having something else come along, or sometimes a prof can be a bit scary, right? Having something that has no skin in the game say, you know what, your argument doesn't make sense, or there's a perspective that you're not thinking about, or there's some big limitation of your view. In my mind, there's a lot of value in catching that early in the process before the student gets to the point of writing the paper, and then they feel defensive because they don't want to go back and rewrite it if they realize that there's some big error, right? So yeah, it's one of those things where I do think there is value in getting some AI, right? But it's got to be kind of supervised in a way, and even discussing how with other people after the fact, right? How did the AI give me feedback? What do I do with this feedback? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense?
Tiny response. But you want sometimes of these meta-cognitive prompts, that's a fancy word for getting students to think about their thinking, and then ask them, how did you arrive at this, right? How did you come up with that premise, or come up with that conclusion?
I read the weirdest paper the other day about, it was an article about this person who gave I think he was using ChatGPT, but he gave ChatGPT like a code word. The code word was potato. And so anytime he used the word potato in a prompt, he instructed the chatbot to be as like brutally critically as possible. Right. So again, like learning, like, and I'm not sure how effective that is necessarily, but I mean, like learning the ability to sort of say, okay, like I really want you to be critical. I don't want you to be complimentary. I want you to tell me what's wrong with my paper, not what's great about it. Right?
Yeah, like this issue of, as you've been putting it, overly complimentary is the biggest problem. Is I think overly complimentary is underselling it. Like it's you're a sycophancy. So it's like
You're right. You're absolutely right.
Especially with something like models of chatbot.
yeah, like with 4.0,
Yeah.
they've recently shut that down, but people have been like mourning it like the loss of a friend. It's been absolutely mental. So I feel like that sycophancy issue is kind of inextricable from, psychosis, as you put it, and is this a product too? Because if they want us to keep using it, there's almost no better way to do that than to say, you're so right every time you put in a prompt. And it's not like, especially with 4.0, I watched a video recently where a guy was able to, within a few prompts, get 4.0 to tell him that he was the smartest baby in 1996 with no reservations, and just like it ran with that. So it can tell you complete falsehoods are the smartest thing it's ever heard. So I don't know how we can get around that, because if companies want us to keep using these technologies, they're going to keep making them.
So,
It certainly shouldn't be in a chatbot, right? We need something to break that of that. The points you're making about sympathy are valid ones. I'm concerned with it too. But we're suggesting that like you can use it as a critical tool, not just like one chatbot. You probably shouldn't use just one model, right? If it's telling you these things that like you're the greatest baby, the most intelligent baby since who knows, well, it could be good kind of narcissism, and then that's going to really detach from reality. Our employers' approaches in the real threat.
but just very quickly, but that's also a definitive claim, right? So again, AI is really good at understanding statistically how concepts go together. But if you ask it to make a true claim in the world, like it doesn't understand what that is, right? It might sound like it understands what it is, but it doesn't, right? So again, something like that, like trying to get definitive claims out of it, even if you can get a definitive claim out of it, like double check it, right? Because that's not what it's good at, right? Like it's just part of it is again just really understanding like what is this thing really doing when I ask it a question, right?
With AI literacy and just literacy, period, and not just literacy. And I was talking to some industry people, and industry's not on the stakeholder list, which is maybe you could include that.
It could be added, yeah.
The scope of your project, but one of the things that I would say, based on what I've heard from industry, is that it's not. They're not necessarily looking for AI literacy. They may be looking for it, but they're not going to say that. They would be more interested in having a seasoned engineer. They want AI in the hands of a seasoned engineer, and that's basically the conversation. We're not going to hire juniors. We have our critical thinkers. The AI is going to will do what the juniors can already do, and the seasoned engineer will have the discipline, the critical thinking, the knowledge of the northern person. So I just wonder, kind of, what are the big? Is there a threshold that you see in your mind while you're writing this about the difference between AI literacy and the value of AI literacy versus kind of just disciplinarity? In fact, they were talking about Socratic questioning and stuff like that. Like, yeah, okay. I've never heard of Socratic questioning. Essentially, telling me about Socratic questioning. So but that's what they're saying. I want students to be doing Socratic questioning, and I'll let my engineers do AI. Is what they was currently have said.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, thinking about some of these, again, like ChatGPT wasn't designed to be an educational tool, right? It was designed by these companies who are trying to make a large language model. But in a couple of years, once the availability of LLMs becomes, much more of a thing, and you'll probably see more diversification in terms of AI companies, I could see the idea of more purpose-made educational products being made that are designed with limitations in mind, designed with focus of what are you specifically trying to get out of it. And that would require, I think, a fair amount of that kind of expertise, right? That kind of disciplinary expertise. The other concern, though, is that, again, the problem with AI and hiring practices right now is that those people will disappear and no one will replace them. Yeah.
He likes to break apart, problems and say, you don't understand it until you can put it back together. Okay. Well.
So maybe we'll take one more question.
Yeah. Sure.
So I understand that this book is kind of like a practice ethic underpinning it. I guess
keyword.
exactly. I was just curious about like if you could explain like how what the resonances of that philosophy has to do with the current situation.
So I can very succinctly value trade-offs, right? That's the big thing. Again, is responsibility part of ethics? Does it float above ethics? This is the question, right? But I think fundamentally, especially for a pragmatist, a lot of times ethics is about value trade-offs. It's not deciding about living in the perfect world. It's deciding you want this and I want this. So how do we figure out on a value level which one is the most important, or how we can sort of work in a way that we can both be happy at the end of the day? And so the big thing is, again, concerned about value trade-offs. Students are going to want efficiency. They're going to want fairness. So, using AI or sort of trying to use methods to detect AI and accusing students afterwards is going to be a big issue, right? Because the student will find it difficult to defend themselves if it's a false positive. And so, again, there's these value trade-offs, right? So where do we decide, even things like skill development, right? Well, it's a genuine discussion. What kinds of skills do undergrads need? Do they need grammar? Do they need to develop all their own grammar skills if they have a computer that can do it for them? Do we need, if we have a calculator, do we all need to memorize our multiplication tables, right? These are important questions, and different people will have different answers to that. So we have to be sort of conscious of where the value trade-offs are without necessarily drifting too much in one direction or the other, right?
So I love this question. I love your response to it. I don't want to go too heavy into ethics with the very end of this presentation. However, you're hitting the nail on the head. So, are we going to have these sort of rigid rules in order to sort of try to solve ethical dilemmas? I think there's trade-offs, like Matt just articulated and put it really succinctly. Look, but ethics is kind of messy in some ways, right? And I'm not sure that AI, if we just relied on it, could solve all of these things. It's us who have to be engaged with it when it comes to AI ethics.
Okay. So and we're over time, so I won't go on for too long. But I just again, so for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm the director of the Ethics of AI Society. If you haven't joined us yet, I'd be very happy if you did join us. We have a website. We have a Teams group that you can join. This has been our third symposium that we've done. And I don't know, maybe it's the best one so far. I don't know. And some people could, yeah, okay. But again, I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank all of our guests, our guests for coming and for presenting their views and having this kind of exchange. I really appreciate it. I want to thank the people who made contributions to the symposium. It would not have been possible without it. So we're very grateful to those people. And with that being said, I think we can kind of end it there. So again, thank you all for coming, and have a good day.